My name is Mike Adams, and my psychiatrist advised me to keep this journal of my thoughts and feelings. I had just gone through a traumatic divorce and was having a hard time dealing with it. The doctor told me to tell my story, including what I was thinking and feeling at the time. He explained that it would help me deal with the trauma. It helped, and after that, journaling became a daily habit. Let me start by saying that I feel like nothing more than a sad divorce statistic. I caught my wife Carrie cheating on me, and now I'm divorced. I suppose it should have mattered that her lover, my boss Justin Bosner, was blackmailing her, but it didn't matter to me in the slightest. I couldn't get the image of them having sex in my marital bed out of my head. Apparently, Justin got my wife drunk at a company party I couldn't attend and took advantage of her. He took pictures and used them to force her to have sex with him several times afterward. I got on the criminal record too because I beat the crap out of him and got arrested. Fortunately, I had a great lawyer, my brother Tom. He was able to prove temporary insanity, and I was acquitted. Then, my former boss tried to sue me for damages. When the jury heard the whole story, they awarded me damages, but the judge told them they had no right to do that. So, taking the hint, I sued him. This time, the jury nailed him, and I was awarded a six-figure sum. I then sued our mutual employer for failing to comply with the morals clause in the employee handbook. I won a seven-figure sum. Financially, I came out of that mess as fragrant as a rose, but I was still divorced and single. Carrie was the love of my life for 8 years. Life was as close to perfect as a husband can expect from his wife. It was only by accident that I found out what my boss was up to when Carrie's phone rang one day and she wasn't in the shower. I answered it. I simply said hi, and the voice on the other end replied, "I can't wait to have fun in bed with you." I immediately recognized my boss in the voice. I was so shocked that I just hung up the phone. A few minutes later, he called back, and my wife answered the phone. I could tell by the look on her face that she was upset about the call, but at the end of the conversation, she simply said okay. That night, Carrie said she wanted to visit a friend. I replied that I didn't mind. We didn't have kids, so it wasn't a problem if either of us wanted to go out. I guess I should introduce myself now. I'm Michael Milbrook, an accountant at a medium-sized firm. Most people call me Mike. I'm good at what I do, but I can't say I enjoy my job. My wife Carrie works as a hygienist for a local dentist. I think most people would say she's more cute than beautiful, but to me, she was the most beautiful person I've ever known. Of course, I'm biased. I loved her to bits the first time I saw her, but after that phone call, I began to question whether I even knew my wife. Suddenly, she wasn't as beautiful as I thought she was. I began to doubt that anything in our 3 years of married life was real. At that point, I had to find out if she was really cheating on me. When my wife left that evening, I immediately got in my car and followed her until she stopped at the motel. I saw her go to the door and knock. When the door opened, I saw my boss there wearing nothing but a towel. He grabbed my wife and hugged her. She pushed him away but walked into the room. What could my wife see in this guy? He was fat and bald. I waited for about 15 minutes and then went to the door. I knocked and said in a fake voice, "Porter, there may be a problem in your room." After a few minutes, Justin opened the door and I stepped inside. I found my wife on one of the beds with no clothes on. Her eyes flashed with horror when she saw it was me. "Oh my God," she screamed. "Mike, things aren't what they seem." I didn't want to be here, but I had no choice. After that, I started abusing my boss. I jumped on him and immediately broke his nose. Then I kicked him in the balls, at which point he passed out, curled up in the fetal position. I then knelt down next to him and kicked him in the face. When I was done with him, he looked like a piece of meat. Then I turned to my wife, who by then was in shock. "You said you don't have a choice. Now you do have a choice, to come home or not. I strongly advise you not to." With that last warning, I left the room and headed home. When I got home, I poured myself a glass of whiskey and drained it. Then I poured myself another and settled into the lounge chair in the family room. About 30 minutes later, there was a knock on the front door. I knew who it was. It was the police. After making sure of who I was handcuffed and taken to the county jail. I had heard stories about how hard it was inside. A sane person would have been scared, but I wasn't. I was still so angry that I didn't care about anything or anyone. Unfortunately, some guy decided he was going to make me his target. I beat him up so badly that he had to be taken to the county hospital. Luckily for me, there was a camera in the cell, and it clearly showed that another inmate started the fight. According to the police, I was just defending myself. I had 2 defeats that night. Both of the men I had beaten had to be sent to the hospital. In Justin's case, they had to remove one testicle, and they weren't sure if the other would ever work properly. For that, I was glad. This jerk probably wouldn't be breeding jerks to annoy women in the future. In addition to my boss losing at least one of his testicles, I also learned that I had cost him 6 teeth, a spleen, and a broken jaw that would cause him constant pain in the future. The funny thing is, I'm not a fighter. My height is just over 6 feet, and my weight is about 170 pounds. However, when I was a kid, my father taught all of his boys how to box, but barring fights with my brothers, I've never been in a real fight. Despite all the pain I had caused my boss, it was nothing compared to my pain. The woman I loved more than anyone in the world had proven to me that she was nothing more than a fraud. Carrie tried to see or call me over the next few days, but I shut her out and tried to bury my pain. I never wanted to be hurt like that again. When my brother arrived, he brought me up to speed. He quickly bailed me out and then took me home to stay with him and his wife, Susan. They were very kind to me, but I was in so much pain that I acted like a total bastard. Finally, one night, Susan pulled me aside and read me the riot act. "Mike, I know you're hurting, but my brother and I aren't the bad guys. If you're going to be a total jerk, you can go home to your cheating wife or get a hotel room." I apologized, and from that day on, I started behaving right again. My sister-in-law and my brother were my safe haven, and I treated them as such. Tom filed divorce papers and simultaneously filed a lawsuit against my employer. A few days later, my former boss sued me for the injuries I had inflicted on his body. Tom was smart. He got the lawsuit against me put on hold until the criminal case was adjudicated. Once I was found not guilty by reason of temporary insanity, Tom turned his sights on my boss. Justin smirked as the trial began. He thought he was going to expose me. However, my former boss had no idea how deep my brother had dug for information. By the time the criminal case against me was finalized, Tom had found several former female employees of the firm who confirmed that Justin had done the same thing to them. And as I said, when the trial was over, the jury wanted to award me damages. Of course, Justin was immediately fired, but that wasn't the worst of it for him. He was arrested for rape. The problem with the case against Justin was that there was no physical evidence. However, 6 women testified against him, telling the same story. I didn't follow the case because I was completely consumed with my divorce. I remember reading that he was found guilty of something, but it wasn't rape. It made no difference to me, except that he had to go to jail. I know that Carrie was called as a witness and basically attended every day of Justin's trial. I remember that everyone was very disappointed that he only got 7 years, even though it had been proven that Carrie had been the victim of an assault. I couldn't get over it. All I could think about was my wife and Justin in the same bed. So I went through with the divorce. I tried to look at it from Carrie's point of view, but I couldn't. If she had just trusted me and told me the truth, I would have dealt with Justin. But she didn't, and the fact that she went back for more made me think that maybe deep down, Carrie liked what she was doing. The final divorce hearing was incredibly traumatizing. Carrie was there with her attorney, and she kept trying to catch my eye. The only time I looked at her, there was pleading in her eyes, but I was in too much pain to bother. When the judge granted our divorce, Carrie became hysterical. I ended up having to call an ambulance. I thought I'd never see her again, but I was wrong. When the last lawsuits were finalized, I had to get on with my life. When all the lawsuits were settled, my fortune was close to $3 million, and that's even after I paid my brother 30% of everything I was awarded. He didn't want to take it, but I made him do it. I was now divorced and earning well, but what was I going to do now? I couldn't go back to my old job. They were unhappy with me, to say the least, and I didn't want to work for them anyway. At this point, my life was just adrift, and I was still in pain. It was Susan who came up with the idea that changed my life, but for a long time, I didn't know whether this change was good or not. She suggested that I take a trip to Europe. She reminded me that I'd always wanted to travel, and now I had the means to do so. Of course, when I talked about it, I always assumed that Carrie would accompany me. Now, Carrie certainly wouldn't be with me. I started my journey in Italy. Everyone I talked to was enamored with the country. I was impressed with the historical sites, and the wine was excellent, but overall, I was disappointed. Next, I traveled by train to Germany. On the train, I met a lovely English woman named Sarah Smith. She proved to be a good traveling companion and a first-class guide. Sarah was pleasant-looking with short blonde hair and soft brown eyes. She was petite, only 5 feet 3 inches tall, with a terrific figure, but what I liked best was her simmering enthusiasm for everything. It was a welcome change from the dreary existence I'd been in for the past 6 months. As it turned out, Sarah was a teacher at a school called Ludgrove. She pronounced the name as if I should recognize it, but it meant nothing to me. Nevertheless, I asked all sorts of questions about the subject Sarah taught and about her in general. I was a little surprised to learn that she taught math and science to children between the ages of 8 and 13, and I could tell from the sparkle in her eyes that she loved what she did. As it seemed to me, Germany would have been a waste of time if it hadn't been for Sarah. Sarah had a wealth of knowledge about World War II. I never had any interest in World War II, but Sarah brought the subject to life, and visiting the places where it took place was fascinating. Before anyone starts thinking about me and Sarah having an affair, I'll dismiss the thought right away. When we first struck up a conversation, she informed me that she had just broken up with a longtime boyfriend. It was a traumatic breakup, and Sarah didn't want to start a new relationship for a while. On the other hand, I was quick to assure her that I myself was not interested in finding a new girlfriend. I recounted my recent divorce chapter in verse. However, I was surprised by Sarah's sympathy for my ex-wife. I simply categorized it as women protecting women and left it at that. Although I was by no means looking for a new girlfriend, I was surprised at the number of women who flirted with me. I wondered if maybe it was the fact that I was starting to look like a bad boy. It seemed like I always had a couple days of growth on my face. In addition, I let my hair grow longer than it ever had before. I assure you this was not done on purpose. It's just that ever since I stopped worrying about work, I've gotten lazy about taking care of my hair. However, the flirting kept me going, and I kept apologizing to Sarah about it. I was embarrassed because some of these women were flirting right in front of her without her knowing about our relationship. Sarah would just laugh about it and even tease me when some woman would start making eyes at me. To be fair, though, Sarah had just as many suitors and was just as embarrassed when they hit on her. I teased her back, of course. From Germany, I traveled to Sweden and Denmark alone. Sarah booked an apartment in Paris for 2 weeks and traveled there. I really liked both Scandinavian countries I visited. The people seemed warm and friendly to me. Without Sarah, it was a little difficult to overcome the language barrier. She spoke 4 languages besides English, Italian, French, German, and Spanish. Nevertheless, even without Sarah, I was able to understand each other by prior arrangement. I met Sarah at her apartment on the last 3 days of her vacation. Paris is a great city, but I wouldn't give 2 cents for the people who live there. I know that's unfair judging by the few people I encountered, but it seemed to me that there was some deep-seated dislike of Americans among Parisians. Frenchmen struck me as obnoxious. The attention Sarah received in other countries paled in comparison to the aggression of the French. One even sat down at our table during dinner and started talking to Sarah in French. This ended badly for the Frenchman when Sarah splashed a glass of wine in his face. He only laughed and gave me a snide look. However, when I stood up and he realized I towered over him by a few inches, he finally took the hint and walked away. The second night in Paris, I took Sarah out to dinner and for a walk along the Seine. It was a beautiful night, and the moon was almost full. We stopped to watch the boats go by. For the first time since my marriage had broken up, I felt at peace. "Sarah," I said, turning to her, "I want to thank you for everything you've done for me. You turned what could have been a miserable trip into something enjoyable. It was exactly what I needed." I leaned over and kissed her cheek. After a second, Sarah put both hands on my face and kissed me on the lips. Admittedly, I kissed her back. When we parted, neither of us said anything about the kiss. Instead, Sarah started talking about the history of the city and some of the sights we'd passed by. I went to bed that night embarrassed but not unhappy. On the last night of our stay in Paris, Sarah cooked us a wonderful dinner in her apartment. We sat on her balcony and chatted for hours. But then I reminded her that we had to get up early the next morning to catch the flight back to London. As I walked past Sarah's room heading for the bathroom, her door opened. She was wearing a beautiful white negligee. In the light from her room, I could see her beautiful body. She put her arms around me and kissed me passionately. I, of course, responded. Before I knew it, we were on her bed, and I began to massage her breasts. Sarah moaned and pulled down her negligee. I started to run my hand down her stomach, kissing her neck, but suddenly I stopped and stood up. "I'm sorry, Sarah," I said in a strangled voice. "I can't do this. It's too soon." I could see the disappointment in her eyes, but Sarah slowly stood up and hugged me. "I understand. It's just that I think I could fall in love with you." "You're a wonderful, beautiful woman," I assured her. "I'm just so confused, and the last thing I want to do is hurt you." She kissed me on the cheek, and I went to the bathroom to finish getting ready for bed. As I stood there brushing my teeth, I kept wondering if I had been a grade A fool for turning Sarah down. The next day, we both didn't say anything about our meeting. When we landed in London, Sarah and I said our goodbyes, and we each took our own cab. I thanked Sarah again for being such a wonderful guide, and then she kissed me on the cheek, of course. Before we parted, we exchanged addresses. We promised to write, but I was sure that would never happen. However, I asked her to have dinner with me on the last night of my vacation, and she agreed. There were still 2 weeks left in my schedule, so I rented a Range Rover and decided to drive around the UK. I planned to visit several major cities in England and then head to Scotland. I was told that the countryside there was very beautiful. I then planned to turn back south and visit Wales. I asked for a Range Rover because I was told that some of the roads in Scotland could be quite steep. At least that was my plan, but it didn't happen. I cursed myself as I tried to find my way out of London the following evening. I lingered at the bank, trying to make sure extra funds would be available when I arrived in Scotland. Not only that, but I had apparently packed my cell phone power cord into one of my suitcases without noticing that the battery was dead. Instead of stopping to look for it in my luggage, I decided to use a paper map. This turned out to be a bad, or good, decision, depending on how one looks at what happened. When I left the bank, it was closing time. I studied the map for about 5 minutes before deciding which way to go. An hour passed, however, and I was hopelessly lost. I got outside London, but I had no idea where I was. I stopped and asked for directions, but only got even more lost. Frustrated, I pulled off the road I was traveling on and stopped under the foliage of trees. I remembered the names of the last few roads I had traveled and decided to look them up on the map. But, 20 minutes later, none of those roads were on my map. I climbed out of the car, uttering unpleasant swear words, and walked back to the trunk. Or, as they say here in England, I started rummaging through my bags, looking for the power cord when it occurred to me that I had left it in my hotel room. I felt like a complete ignoramus. I was in a foreign country with no phone and no idea where I was. While I was trying to figure out what I should do next, I decided to get my gun. Yes, I know it's illegal to have a gun in England. In fact, I think it's illegal to own a gun in most of Europe. But I'm an American, and I wasn't going to travel without protection. I carried a Ruger 9mm pistol with 2 magazines, each holding 18 rounds. I figured that would be enough for protection. You may be wondering how I was able to get my gun through customs. Actually, it was not that difficult. First, I disassembled the gun and then put its parts in special boxes that I made myself. If they x-rayed my suitcase and saw what was inside those boxes, the strategically placed metal made the parts look completely different. For example, the barrel looked like a smoking pipe. Anyway, I didn't have the slightest problem the entire trip. You may be wondering, if the gun is in pieces, how can it be useful? Usually, when I traveled in the countryside, I kept the parts close to me. I could quickly reassemble the gun if needed. So far, I hadn't needed it, and I hoped I never would. But now I was in the middle of nowhere, and it was getting dark. I assembled the gun and loaded it. Gathering it up, I slipped the gun into my belt, then I followed the road, wondering where it led. It looped until I saw a big stately house up ahead on a hill. Surely, someone in that house could tell me where the hell I was. The road curved up the hill and brought me to the back of the house. My heart dropped as there were no lights visible on this side of the mansion. I turned off the car and started walking towards the house. I was just about to round the corner when I heard screams and 2 gunshots. Quickly looking around the building, I saw 2 men lying face down on the ground. The other man was holding a small boy with a hood over his head, and he was kicking violently. The other 2 men were shouting at each other, and one of them was pointing at the 2 men lying on the ground. "You messed up big time, buddy," the man yelled, pointing at me. "Go back inside and make sure everyone is still locked up." As soon as the man disappeared inside and the man struggling with the boy tried to put him in the car, I got out and yelled, "Drop your weapons and put your hands up." The man didn't put the gun down. Instead, he turned around and shot at me with lightning speed. I returned fire. His bullet missed him, but mine hit him in the shoulder. Not only did he drop the gun, but he fell to his knees. The man holding the boy released him to see what happened. At the same instant, the boy rushed to run. The man rushed after him. I took aim at him, but the shot was weak. Nevertheless, it hit one of his legs. It knocked him down, but only for a moment. The man got up quickly and waddled in the other direction. With a temporary reprieve, I rushed to my car and started it. I stepped on the gas pedal and roared out from behind the building. As I raced past the kneeling man, he grabbed his gun. A few seconds later, he was firing. I figured he wasn't firing accurately, so I was perfectly safe. I was wrong. I felt a burn on the lower part of my left side. When I reached out, my arm was covered in blood. I had no idea how badly I was hurt, but I couldn't stop. I rushed down the road and found a panicked boy running parallel to it. I stopped and opened the back door behind me. "Get in, boy," I shouted. "They'll be following us in a few seconds." Fear was written all over the guy's face, but I guess he figured. I was a safer option than the lunatic behind us. As soon as he slammed the door shut, I pedaled again, and we sped down the driveway toward what I realized was the house. "Hey kid," I asked, looking at him in the rearview mirror, "do you even know where we are?" The guy seemed shocked and only shook his head. When I got to the end of the driveway, the choice was 50-50, right or left. I chose left, a bad decision. If I went right, it would lead to the highway, and there I could quickly find help. On the left, however, I went deeper into the countryside where there didn't seem to be houses. I later learned that this area was home to some very large estates. There were literally kilometers between some of the houses. "Damn," I said out loud, "we're almost out of gas." The boy looked a little embarrassed, so I switched to British language. "Petrol," I quickly corrected, "we're almost out of gas." "Oh," the boy commented weakly, "this is awful. What shall we do?" "I'll get off this road," I said, took a sharp left, and started racing up the hill. Thank God I had a Range Rover. With it, the trip overland became a breeze. I didn't think the Mercedes I saw in the driveway would do the job. Checking the compass built into the dashboard, I said to the boy, "I'm going to drive south, because for that matter, London is south of us." I looked at the boy again in the rearview mirror, and it was clear that he was scared but still in control. I gave him credit for that. Most kids would have been knocked over and freaking out by now. As we rushed along, I asked him what his name was. The question seemed to startle him, but he stammered, "George." "George, my name is Mike," I told him. "Now tell me what's going on, please, sir." "What is your name?" "My own name?" This question threw me into confusion until it suddenly dawned on me what he was asking. "Oh, my name is Mike Adams." "Thank you for saving me, Mr. Adams," the boy said timidly. "I haven't saved anyone yet," I replied, and continued my questioning. "Where are we, and why did those people try to take you away?" I don't know exactly," George replied, his voice shaking, and I didn't want to push him too hard. I liked that he was showing as much self-control and courage as he had in him. "I was at my friend Peter's house at the weekend when these men broke in. They threw a bag over my head, and one of them lifted me up. I don't know what happened to Peter, his parents, or their servants. It looks like Peter's parents have money, and it's a kidnapping. They may have taken Peter as well." I offered my perspective on the situation. "We have to keep moving until we find help," I said firmly. We continued through fields and streams, but found no houses or any buildings. All I could think of was to keep heading south. Eventually, we had to come to a road. We went over one hill, down into a field, and then up another hill. As we climbed the second hill, the car started to stall. I realized that I was almost out of gas. So, I found a bush where I could hide the car. When the car stopped, I opened the door and walked around to the back. Lifting the back door, I pulled one of the suitcases toward me and began to examine it. Not finding what I needed, I pulled the second suitcase toward me. After about 30 seconds of searching, I pulled out my flashlight. If British, that is a torch. I turned it on and searched the bags again. After about a minute, I found what I was looking for, my second magazine. "George, listen," I said to the boy as I opened the door for him, "we're going to have to set off on foot. I don't know if these people will realize I'm off the road, but we have to assume they will and keep moving until we find help." Before heading out, I grabbed 2 sweaters, a wool hat, a large bottle of water, and 4 packages of crackers. It was getting chilly outside, and I didn't know how long we would run until we found help. Besides, I didn't know what to do with the baby, but I was very hungry. I knew the car was pointing south, so I looked up at the sky and picked out a fairly bright star in that direction. I figured we could follow it. We walked for about 3 hours, stopping occasionally to rest and drink. We crossed several streams, but I didn't dare fill my bottle with water. It was nearing midnight, and I knew the boy was exhausted, but in spite of the hard journey, he did not utter a word of complaint. We didn't talk much because I didn't want to give away our location in case someone was nearby. Finding a bush, I sketched 2 mounds of leaves to make a bed. Then I told George to get some sleep. He didn't argue, and in a few minutes, he was sound asleep. I stayed awake for another hour. The first thing I did was check my wound. It turned out to be a deep cut along my left side where the bullet had grazed me. The wound was still bleeding slightly, so I tore off part of my undershirt and bandaged it as best I could. Then I took one of the sweaters and put it on George, the other I put on myself. After that, I fell into a very uneasy sleep. I was awakened by the first rays of the morning sun. When I woke up, I groaned, my side hurt like hell. Now I wished I had brought ibuprofen. When I sat up, it woke George up. When he sat up, I asked, "How are you feeling this morning?" "I'm in a lot of pain, sir," he replied. I laughed. "Here, have some crackers." I tossed them to him in the back, and while he sat and ate, I studied the young man. He was still frightened, but he held himself surprisingly confidently. I handed him water and another package of crackers, then I checked my wound, and thankfully, it was no longer bleeding. "I'm sorry, sir," George said timidly. "What's going to happen to us?" "We'll find help." Then your parents will pick you up, and I'll continue my vacation. But first, I guess I'll have to go to the doctor to get stitches. You look awfully brave, sir, he said, looking at the ground. I wish I were as brave. What are you talking about? You were very brave, I assured him. Most kids would have bawled their eyes out. But I've been crying. He looked at me anxiously. You won't tell anyone, will you? George, I said softly, it's okay to cry. Everyone cries at one time or another. Crying just shows that you care about something. There's no shame in it. I just don't want people to be disappointed in me, George said, looking directly at me. George, I'm going to give you one of life's most important lessons, I said with a smile. There's only one person you never want to disappoint. Who could that be? George looked at me in confusion. The only person you don't want to disappoint is yourself, I said firmly. If you do what you think you need to do and give it your best, you don't need to apologize to anyone. And if someone tells you otherwise, tell them to back off. This made George laugh, and his mood began to lift. After gathering our meager belongings, we set off again. I was in a lot of pain, and I knew my wound was infected. I simply had no way to keep it clean. Besides, I no longer had a guiding star, and I wanted to stay close to the tree line rather than walk openly across the fields. It was harder to walk than the day before, but we managed to hold on. We could see helicopters in the distance. I hoped they were looking for us and wanted them to come in our direction. By noon, we were out of water, and I had no choice but to fill our bottle from the creek. I just hoped there were no harmful bacteria floating in the water. Nevertheless, I decided we needed to be found before any of us got sick. Night came on, and we still hadn't found a single house. I afterward learned that somehow we had managed to make our way between at least a dozen houses. If we had only deviated a few hundred yards to one side or the other, we would have spotted them. As soon as I found another bush and prepared the beds, we sat down. Only this time, there weren't as many leaves, and I was in a lot of pain. Plus, I felt a little woozy and knew I must have a fever. The next day, we started again, only now I was having trouble keeping up. George's eyes were filled with sympathy, uncertainty, and fear. I knew George still didn't trust me completely, but I just smiled at him and told him it was okay. He didn't believe me for a second. Throughout the second and now third day, our conversations became noticeably more animated. I was no longer worried about being overheard. We talked about many things, his studies, his friends, even a little about his parents. He didn't seem to want to talk about them, so I didn't insist. He said that his father and mother were very strict and expected a lot from him. I reminded him again that the only person he had to satisfy was himself. Toward noon, I began to burn with impatience. We had reached a place where we could not stay in the forest. We needed to cross this field to move on. I told George that we were going to quickly cross the field and get to the woods on the other side. We were about 100 yards from the new tree line when I heard the distinctive sound of a diesel engine. I cursed to myself because it sounded like a Mercedes. "Run, George!" I ordered and started after him. I looked back just in time to see the Mercedes come over the hill and down into the field, straight at us. We had just reached a group of fallen trees when shots rang out. They were coming from the car that was coming at us. We climbed over fallen trees, and I took up position. "George, listen to me carefully," I said, holding his right hand. "I want you to keep running. Try to get as far away from here as you can. But when you hear the shooting stop, find a place to hide and don't come out until they're gone." "But Mr. Adams, what about you?" he asked, panic in his eyes. "I'll stall them as long as I can," I said. "Now, be brave and take off like I told you to." I think George was about to argue with me, but I pushed him away, and he took off running. That was good because the Mercedes was less than 100 feet away. They started shooting again, only this time I started firing back. I don't think they were expecting that. In Britain, people don't usually have firearms anyway. The car skidded and came to a stop, tumbling sideways. The men hid behind the car and started shooting. As far as I could tell, there were 5 men in the car, and they were all armed. I found a place where I could kneel down and have space between the trees to shoot. As I returned fire, I hoped like hell that George was keeping a huge distance between us. I was halfway through the second magazine when it happened. It seemed like this firefight had been going on for hours, but it had been less than 5 minutes so far. I had been lucky. The trees had blocked most of the shots, but one bullet found its way through the branches and slammed into the right side of my chest. I was thrown backward to the ground. It took 10 seconds or more before I was able to get to my feet. While I was lying there, one of the fighters decided to rush my position. This was a bad mistake for him. I hit him in the center, and he went down. I fired 2 more shots, but then I started to lose consciousness. At that moment, I heard a rumble, and a shadow passed over us. I saw helicopters coming towards us. Armed men were rappelling down the ropes, firing as they descended. Then, I got very tired and closed my eyes. One day, I woke up to a bright light and incredible pain. A woman immediately came to me, and I remember someone saying, "We need to get him back to the operating room." Then darkness descended on me again. When I woke up the second time, I felt like I was floating on something. The room was bright, and there was no pain. A nurse in a matron suit was standing next to me, measuring my pulse. When she saw that my eyes were open, she smiled. "Welcome back, Mr. Adams," she said in a delightful British accent. "It's a pleasure to see you among the living. You had us worried for a while. We thought we were going to lose you at a few moments last night, but the doctor thinks you finally pulled through." My throat was sore, but I had to speak. "Boy," was all I could wheeze. "It's all right, Mr. Adams," the nurse said kindly. "Someone will be in shortly to talk to you." The nurse didn't really answer my questions, and that made me anxious, but soon I fell asleep. When I woke up again, I saw that it was night. After a while, an orderly appeared and fed me soup, helping me drink juice. There were IVs around my bed, and all of them were being injected into me. I don't know how long I slept, but when I woke up again, it was already light. The doctor was standing next to the bed, studying the chart. Boy," I wheezed out my questions again. "Ah, Mr. Adams, you're awake." "Good," the doctor smiled at me. "There is nothing wrong with the boy, however, I'm told he was very upset when you were brought in. He held you in his arms and begged you to wake up. He was covered in your blood, but otherwise unhurt. Is he a relative of yours?" I shook my head, but even such a light load tired me out, and I fell asleep again. But I guess I didn't sleep long because it was still light when I woke up a few minutes later. The nurse came in and smiled when she saw that I was awake. "How are you feeling, Mr. Adams?" she asked. "My throat really hurts," I replied in little more than a whisper. "It also hurts my chest and my side." "I'll get you something for the pain," she said, and then added, "There are people who want to talk to you. Do you feel strong enough to do that?" I nodded. A gentleman who looked to be about 40 years old entered my room. He sat down in the chair next to my bed. He had hair the color of salt and pepper and a bushy mustache. His cheeks had a ruddy hue. "Mr. Adams, I'm Inspector Blair from Scotland Yard. I'd like an informal statement from you, if I may." "Sure," I said, and was surprised that my voice seemed firmer. "You've obviously been through quite an ordeal," the inspector began. "The doctors tell me that things have been going your way for a while. They are still a little concerned about your infection, but fortunately, you seem to be on the road to recovery. But I was wondering if you could tell me about your involvement in the incident last Monday." I shook my head slowly, trying to gather my thoughts. "I'm afraid I can't tell you much. I really have no idea what was going on. I think I stumbled into a kidnapping, and before I knew it, George and I were on the run. We spent days trying to find help, but we never found anyone. Then the kidnappers caught up with us. I tried to hold them off long enough for George to escape." The inspector smiled at me as if he knew much more about what had happened than I did. "Well, that wouldn't have been hard since I knew almost nothing. Tell me, Mr. Adams, how did you end up in the exact house where the kidnapping took place? I'm lost, I admitted with annoyance. I didn't charge my phone before I left London, and I tried to use a paper map, but all I managed to do was get hopelessly lost. I found a dirt road that led to the back of the mansion. I hoped that I could get directions from someone there. However, as I approached the front, I saw that they were trying to kidnap George. I had my gun with me and used it to free the boy we left in the car I had rented, but we were almost out of gas when the car stopped. George and I had to walk, like I said. We couldn't find anyone to help us. After that, I just tried to hold them off. How did you find us? I asked. Search teams and helicopters have been combing the area since the abduction was reported, one of the helicopter pilots replied. One of the helicopter pilots spotted a car rushing down the hill and followed it. They came across your gunfire and stopped it. Then you and the boy were taken to the hospital. At first, we thought the boy was badly wounded because there was a lot of blood on him, but as it turned out, it was your blood. He refused to leave your side. I told him he was brave, I replied absent-mindedly. What was that, Mr. Adams? The inspector asked. Nothing, he was just very brave, I clarified. The inspector leaned back in his chair and smiled. That's an amazing story. It's true, I swear, I protested. If you don't believe me, ask George. Oh, I believe you, Mr. Adams, the inspector assured me. However, there is one point I would like to clarify. The gun you were defending yourself with, where did you get it? I was like a deer in headlights. The phrase that went through my head was, oh, no. I knew I was in trouble now, and yet I knew that without that gun, I'd probably be dead. I brought it with me from the United States, I replied quietly. I don't think so, Mr. Adams, the inspector grinned. Bringing a gun into the United Kingdom is a crime. The gun we found had the serial numbers wiped off, so you must have gotten the weapon from the kidnappers. You're very lucky, don't you think? My confusion was suddenly replaced by crystal clarity. The inspector was offering me a plausible denial about the gun. I was not one to look a gift horse in the mouth. I quickly confirmed the inspector's assumption. Yes, that's exactly what happened. I caught one of the kidnappers off guard and was able to take the gun away from him, I explained. Excellent, Inspector Blair said, standing up. You know, I could do with a cup of tea. Can I get you one too? To tell you the truth, Inspector, I'd kill for a cup of coffee, I replied. He laughed and said, I'll see what I can do. 10 minutes later, the inspector returned with an attendant who had a cup of tea and 1 cup of coffee. There was also a plate of cookies, which I believe the English call biscuits. Mr. Adams, the inspector began, taking a sip of tea. I have a lot to tell you, and there's a lot we have to resolve before you talk to anyone else. So let me begin by correcting one misconception of yours. The boy you know as George is actually Peter, and Peter is the future Duke of Windsor. You will probably refer to him as the future King of England. However, the correct title is future King of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. This information stunned me to the core. I couldn't think of anything to say, so I kept silent. His Highness was spending the weekend with his friend George at the estate of Lord and Lady Ashford. Lord and Lady are George's parents. The guards consisted of 8 men, 2 of them were killed, 3 seriously wounded, the rest incapacitated. It was a well-planned, well-coordinated attempt to kidnap the prince. In fact, if you hadn't stumbled upon it, they would have succeeded in kidnapping him, and we would have been left in complete ignorance as to what happened. Why these people tried to kidnap the prince, we don't know yet, nor do I have any idea how they knew where the prince was. That's something we'll certainly look into. In the meantime, all I know for sure is that you are one hell of a hero. I considered the inspector's information, then weakly replied, I don't feel like a hero. In fact, I'm just a little uncomfortable. Should I call someone? The inspector asked, but I shook my head no. I'll be fine. Now, we need to decide what to do next. The inspector took a final sip of tea and pulled out a notepad and pen. Rumors of an assassination attempt on the prince leaked out almost immediately. The country has been in a state of agitation ever since. Now that the prince has been safely recovered, celebrations have been going on for days both here and abroad, but it has also put virtually all of Britain's investigative agencies under intense pressure to get to the bottom of what happened. I suddenly felt panic because the whole incident resembled a terrorist attack. If so, my family as well as myself could be in danger. May I make a request? You can certainly make a request, but whether I can honor it is another matter. Could you please not mention my name and everything I asked immediately? Interesting, the inspector said, smoothing his mustache. Why would you want to do that? I just think it's safer this way, I tried to explain. If it's the work of terrorists and I'm on the list of those who interfered with them, they might try to retaliate against my family and me. Yes, I realize there could be a problem, the inspector agreed. I will discuss it with my superiors and let you know in a few days. For now, we're keeping you in the dark. Are there people who might become alarmed if they don't hear from you? If so, we will contact them by making up a legend. Maybe my parents, I said after thinking for a moment. What day is it? It's Friday the 6th. I've lost almost a week, I said quietly. In a week, this Sunday, I have to fly back to the United States. I doubt I'll be out of the hospital in a week. It might be best if you write to my parents using my account and just tell them I'm extending my vacation. We found your itinerary and your luggage. We've been watching the places you plan to stay to see if anyone contacted you. So far, no one has attempted to do so. Oh, another person you should know about, I said, remembering my obligation. I'm supposed to have dinner with Miss Sarah S.M. on Saturday night. The inspector's eyebrows rose when I mentioned my participation in the dinner. And how do you know Miss S.M.? I met her on the train to Germany, I explained. We became friends, and she became my unofficial tour guide. There was nothing romantic between us, she was just very kind and helpful. I understand, the inspector said, standing up. Do you have an email for her? When I nodded, the inspector continued, I think we'd best email her and let her know that you've been injured. You don't have any serious injuries, but you would prefer to be treated by your doctor at home. In the meantime, there will be officers outside your room around the clock until we decide how to proceed. I'll contact you in a few days when we have a better understanding of everything. In the meantime, I hope you realize that we will keep you incommunicado. That won't be a problem, I shook my head. The next few days were very difficult. As I started to get better, they started to reduce my pain medication. This meant that I was in pain at times, especially just after physiotherapy. I started to get a fever from being confined to my room. At first, it was interesting to watch television reports. There was a mood of grateful jubilation, especially in the UK, but there was also outrage. But after a day or two of nonstop reporting, it became painful to watch. I suppose I was suffering from a mild form of post-traumatic stress disorder. 2222222222222222222. Just when I was beginning to believe that Inspector Blair had forgotten about me, he arrived the following Tuesday. I hoped he would give me some good news, like when I would be allowed to leave. I just wanted to get better and come home. I was standing at the window, wishing I was outside, when Inspector Blair came into my room. You're looking remarkably well, Mr. Adams. I'm so glad you're recovering so quickly. That makes my news all the more gratifying, he said. Sounds promising, I said, taking a seat on the edge of the bed. We are working hard to get to the bottom of this dastardly attack. Unfortunately, we still don't know who is behind the kidnapping. However, we have managed to capture 2 of the perpetrators alive, and we hope that at least one of them will tell us what we want to know. Well, that makes my request as urgent as ever, I replied. I hope you won't mention my name and everything. You're an interesting man, Mr. Adams. Most men would like to boast the title of hero, but you wish to remain anonymous. Your primary concern is for your family, which is commendable. But to reassure you, my superiors have agreed that you should remain anonymous. We'll do our best to keep your name out of the public domain. I must admit that my superiors were in favor of releasing your name immediately. Some people in the department suspected you might have been part of a conspiracy. At first, they didn't believe your story that you just stumbled into a kidnapping. Some believed you were part of a conspiracy but chickened out at the last minute. However, a check of the tracking device on the rental car confirmed everything you told us. In addition, the prince insisted that you had nothing to do with the kidnapping. That's great, I said with a smile. I guess it means I can go back to the United States as soon as I'm released from the hospital. I can't wait to get home. Yes, you will be allowed to leave the country as soon as you are discharged, the inspector confirmed. We believe that the sooner you leave the country, the safer you will be. Have you gotten any messages from my parents? I asked. Yes, they tried calling you and emailing you, the inspector confirmed. Naturally, we couldn't answer the calls, but we informed them by email that you only had a small amount of cell coverage. I have spoken to the doctors, and they will discharge you in a week on Saturday. And we have taken the liberty of booking you on a flight leaving the same day. You will leave the hospital after lunch that afternoon, accompanied by security. On Friday, when I was supposed to leave the hospital, the inspector showed up again and gave me back my cell phone. He said I could call anyone I wanted. I called my parents and told them I had an accident. I lied and said it was nothing serious, but I needed to go to the hospital. My mom was very upset and wanted to fly over to help me get back. I lied again and said I fell off my bike and had an unfortunate collision with some metal, but I was fine. I told her I would be home before she could even buy a ticket. That seemed to reassure her. Saturday morning, after breakfast, I got up and got dressed. I couldn't wait to leave the hospital and go home. Around 11 o'clock, I heard a noise in the hallway outside my room. When I looked out, I saw a well-dressed couple and a little boy walking toward my room. It took a moment, but then I recognized George, or as I corrected myself, Peter. As the pair approached, men and women on both sides of the corridor bowed or curtsied. It was unreal to watch. You read stories about how British royalty are treated, but you never expect to see it firsthand. The couple was very gracious to everyone they passed, but Peter seemed nervous. When he finally saw me, he quickened his step and got to me before his parents did. Your Highness, I nodded with a smile. Mr. Adams, I'm so glad to see you in good health, he said with a wide smile. When they were lifting you into the helicopter, I was so afraid they had killed you. Thank you so much for helping me. By then, the King and Queen were already by their son's side. Your Majesties, I said with a slight bow, I am truly honored. No, Mr. Adams, that honor belongs to us, the King said as he extended his hand, and we shook it. I couldn't believe that I was shaking the King's hand and would never be able to tell anyone about it. Oh well, I said to myself, it's for the best. Miss Adams, the Queen continued, I cannot thank you enough for saving our son. It has been very difficult for me since the incident. I shudder to think of what might have happened had you not been there. You will always be in our thoughts and prayers. The Queen held out her hand to me, but quickly looked away when I took it, then lifted my hand and kissed it. I was completely surprised by this act and didn't know how to react. You can be proud of your son, was all I could say. He was very brave under very difficult circumstances. Without his help, I don't think we would have made it. That was the end of the meeting, and they left. The royal family was warned not to make much noise around me. It might cause people to question me. I would learn a little later that this visit was supposedly part of their royal schedule. However, they insisted on visiting the hospital to thank me personally. I was touched by the gesture. All the time spent in the hospital had given me a lot of time to think about my life, and I wasn't particularly pleased with myself. The flight home still had me thinking about what to do next. My parents were there to meet me, and I saw the relief in my mom's eyes when her fears about my health were dispelled. Nevertheless, she hugged me tightly. My dad was also happy to see me home and hugged me too. I grumbled a little and explained that my wounds were still a little sore. Nevertheless, I was delighted by his hug. It was something he rarely did. My father always told people he didn't like hugs. That's not really true. Now he takes every opportunity to hug my mom. As we stood at the baggage carousel, my mom became very calm and serious. Mike, I did something that you might be mad at me about, but please, if you're going to be angry, then be angry with me. I can't think of anything you do, Mom, to make me mad. You might change your mind very soon, Mom said, looking toward one of the exit doors. I looked over to where Mom was looking and saw Carrie standing there, looking confused. Her reddened eyes told me that she had been crying. Carrie looked pale and was trembling slightly. A few weeks ago, I would have gotten mad at my mom and left. But when you're as close to death's doorstep as I was, you get a completely different perspective on life. Suddenly, a lot of things that you thought were so important no longer are. As I looked at Carrie, I no longer saw a cheating wife. I saw a woman who was lonely, sad, and scared. I also saw a woman who had been rudely taken advantage of and a woman who still seemed to love me. She was still the beautiful woman I had fallen in love with. I smiled at her and walked over to where she stood. "Hi, Carrie," I said softly. "Thank you for coming to welcome me home." At that moment, Carrie's reserve broke, and she threw herself into my arms. She sobbed on my shoulder, repeating over and over, "I'm so sorry. Please forgive me." I calmed her down and then took her to where my parents were standing. They had already taken my luggage. I didn't like the food on the airplane, so I hardly ate anything, I said cheerfully. "What do you say I take you all out to dinner? I'm starving." I can't say that things between me and Carrie suddenly got better, but it was a start. In the beginning, I had no idea what I wanted. All I knew was that I didn't want to punish Carrie anymore. I wanted her to be happy. A few days later, I invited her to lunch to discuss our problems. Then, we started going to counseling sessions and finally started seeing each other again. From our sessions, I learned that Carrie was terrified of disappointing me. That's why she agreed to have an affair. I also learned that I had ingrained this belief myself, lavishing praise on my wife when she did what I thought was good, and when she didn't meet my expectations, Carrie saw my disappointment. I never realized I was doing this, but in retrospect, I realized it was absolutely true. It took 6 months to resolve our issues, but I never stopped loving Carrie. So, in the presence of a small number of relatives, Carrie and I were remarried in her parents' backyard. Of all the people present at our remarriage, other than ourselves, the happiest, in my opinion, were our mothers. I took Carrie on a cruise for our honeymoon. Oddly enough, Carrie and I didn't have sex before we got married. Neither of us wanted to dampen our emotions. So, that first night in our cabin, we were both nervous. I know it sounds ridiculous because we had made love hundreds of times while we were married the first time, but this second marriage was very different from the first. I know that I, for one, felt connected to Carrie on a much deeper level. To me, Carrie had always been the most beautiful girl I had ever known. She had long blonde hair and a button nose, but it was her soft brown eyes that attracted me the first time I met her that still captivated me. When I climbed into bed with Carrie, I could feel her shivering with anticipation. She smelled so wonderful, and she was even better to the touch. The rest of the honeymoon was very much like that first night. Sure, we went on excursions, went dancing, attended shows, but mostly we made love. I was in love with my wife again, but there was still a note of distrust in the back of my mind. It didn't raise its ugly head until years later. I believe it happened that very first night, but 2 months later, Carrie found out she was pregnant. 7 months later, we had a boy whom we named Grant. 11 months after that, we had a baby girl we named Louise. 3 years after that, Carrie went back to work part-time. At first, I didn't mind Carrie's new job, but I couldn't help it. With each passing month, my suspicions and jealousy grew. I kept my misgivings to myself, but it was taking its toll on our marriage. Even though Carrie wasn't doing anything to make me worry, I still worried. At the same time, without realizing it myself, I was beginning to distance myself from my wife. I must have been mentally preparing myself for this because I couldn't shake the feeling that Carrie would betray me again. Carrie suffered from my moods, and it was affecting her. We began to fight more and more often. Eventually, I began to think about divorce. It was Carrie who once again persuaded me to go to counseling with a psychologist. At first, it didn't seem to do much, but gradually I realized the hole I had dug for myself. After I realized my problem, our relationship became much better. Then, we began to rebuild our relationship. For the next year, my family and I had a wonderful life. Then disaster struck. We didn't know that Justin Bosner had been released early from prison. During his time in prison, his hatred for me had grown exponentially. Carrie and I had just put the kids to bed when we heard several windows in the front of our house shattered. I went to check to see what was wrong, and Carrie went to make sure the kids were okay. When I walked into the living room, Justin was standing in front of me, pointing a gun at me. "Well, Mikey, I've waited a long time for this moment," he growled. "I'm going to let your guts out and then have some fun with your pretty wife, I'm sure. She'll enjoy it as much as she did before." I felt like ripping the asshole's head off, so I took a step forward, but he extended the gun even further. "I wouldn't try that, Mike. I could stab you before you even get close to me, but I want this moment to last longer." At that moment, I saw a streak fly into the living room from the direction of the dining room. Carrie was clutching the gun, and Justin was trying to wrestle it away. I moved instantly, but the gun went off before I could get it out. Carrie collapsed to the floor, and I slammed my fist into Justin's jaw, causing him to jerk backward and hit his head on the wall. Then I was on my knees, hugging Carrie. I could see blood coming from her belly. I grabbed my phone off the coffee table and dialed 911. It seemed like hours, but 8 minutes later, the police and ambulance were on the scene. I grabbed a towel to press it against the wound. I remember crying, "Please hold on, Carrie. Please don't die." Carrie lay in my arms and looked down at me. "You're the only one I've ever loved. Thank you for taking me back. Take care of our children." Then her eyes closed. They never opened again. The hospital staff worked tirelessly to save her, but the damage was too great. I was completely out of it. Thank God we have two mothers. They moved in with me and took care of everything while I was out. It took losing Carrie for her to finally realize that I was her one true love. I know I was at the funeral, but I don't remember anything. All I remember is thinking I should be the one dead, not Carrie. Justin was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. Before his trial, he killed himself in prison. I was angry that he got off so lightly. It took about 3 months, but I finally started to get out of my depression. My children were the main reason for my recovery because I had to be strong for them. They missed their mother as much as I did, but as children are supposed to do, they recovered quickly. I didn't know if I would ever recover myself, but they hoped I would be a support for them. For Carrie's sake, I couldn't let them down, but I was still damaged, and no matter how hard I tried to hide it, my mom knew it. It was she who eventually suggested I leave with the kids. I resisted at first, but eventually agreed to let us return to the UK. My parents and Carrie's parents agreed to come with me to help me with the children. By this time, I was no longer worried about returning to England. About 18 months after the kidnapping, Scotland Yard uncovered a plot to kidnap the Crown Prince. It turned out that the plot had been hatched by a very small splinter group of anti-kings. There were only 30-odd people in the group, but 2 of them worked at Buckingham Palace and had access to the royal schedules. Most of the group didn't understand what their leaders were doing, but they all received prison sentences of varying lengths. But the ultimate plan was to kill the Crown Prince. Since the divorce, I have invested the money from the settlement. By now, the amount had grown to almost $5 million, so I decided to make this trip extravagant and booked first-class tickets for everyone. I booked a room at the Langham, one of the best hotels in London. Then I made sure to book a passenger van because I wanted to complete my tour of Scotland and Wales. I didn't realize it, but a circus was about to break out in London, and I was about to be at the center of it. When I spoke to Inspector Blair and asked that my name be removed from all records, I assumed that the records would be sealed forever. However, the records were not sealed permanently, they just sealed the records for 5 years. If the case remained unsolved, the seal would be extended. It took another year before someone asked to open the records to the public. Finally, the request was granted. I asked that my name not appear on all the reports, but it didn't happen. My name was in all the reports. Even when we were on the flight back to the UK, there were some very persistent reporters looking at the reports. If I had the slightest idea of what was about to happen, I would never have gone. I would have moved my entire family to a shelter and stayed there until things subsided, but I had no idea. So, I prepared for a trip that I hoped would help me heal my soul from the loss of Carrie and the guilt I felt for not fully trusting her love. As I was sorting through my suitcases and starting to prepare for this trip, I discovered Sarah Smith's long-forgotten phone number. I was sure the number was no longer in service or was being used by someone else. Still hoping it might be her number, I called. If I could get in touch with her, maybe I could convince her to join our tour. Either way, I felt like I still owed her a dinner for the one I canceled when I fled England over 6 years ago. I was pleasantly surprised to find that the number indeed belonged to Sarah. I was even happier that she remembered who I was right away. Sarah told me that she was very disappointed that I had to cancel our dinner meeting. However, Sarah also assured me that she understood exactly why I had to do it. I felt a little guilty that I couldn't tell her the real reason, but it was a chapter of my life that was better left in the past. We talked for a good 2 hours. I can only imagine what my phone bill will be when I get home. Nevertheless, it was a very pleasant conversation. I have a few friends who are so close that we can go months without talking, and when we do, it feels like no time has passed at all. That was the case with Sarah. Gradually, we told each other about our lives over the past 5 years. Sarah was happy when I told her that I had remarried Carrie and that we had 2 children. Sarah told me that she was still teaching at the same school, but now as an assistant principal. She had only been married for a short time, about 2 years ago. The marriage had been a failure, and the divorce had been particularly nasty. Her ex-husband was extremely embittered. It was obvious that Sarah's failed marriage was still bothering her. So, I finally told her about Carrie's murder and my attempts to rebuild my life. There was a long silence after I told her about Carrie's death, and for a moment I thought Sarah might have hung up on me. But then I heard her sobbing on the other end of the line. "Oh, Michael, I'm so sorry for you," she said in a trembling voice. She always addressed me by my first name and rarely by my nickname. "Nevertheless, you have children. I know it seems small consolation now, but in the years to come, you will realize how truly blessed you are." At first, I didn't know what to say. But then, with a half-joking, half-serious grin, I said that we should leave the sad stories in the past. Sarah agreed and began telling me about funny incidents her students had done. I was grateful for the humor, but eventually got to the true purpose of my call. "I know it's last minute, but I'm going to come to England with the kids and their grandparents," I explained. "I'd like to be able to do a little touring. If you get a chance to free up, I'd love to have you join us." "Oh, I'd love to do that, Michael, but I can't get free right now. We're only halfway through the semester, and I have so many meetings I have to attend." "I'm sorry," Sarah replied. "I understand," I said, but I couldn't hide my disappointment. "But look, I still owe you dinner from last time. Maybe you could free up an evening to have dinner with me?" "I'd love to do that," Sarah replied immediately. "However, you must promise to bring your children and their grandparents." "I'd love to meet all of them." "Wonderful," I said cheerfully. "I'll call you when I get to London, and we'll work something out." As I said, even as we flew across the Atlantic, secrets that I hoped would be locked away forever were about to come out. We flew in early in the morning, and I knew the best way to beat jet lag was to stay awake until it was time to go to bed in a new place. If you do this, you will be synchronized to the new time zone the next day. Since the kids slept for most of the flight, they were ready to go. My parents and Carrie's parents weren't thrilled with the plan but agreed because I insisted. As soon as we were checked into our rooms, I called Sarah and made dinner arrangements with her for the next night. Then we set off to explore London. We visited the Tower of London, took a boat tour on the Thames, and visited Legoland in Windsor. We all had a great time, but that was all about to change the next morning. That night, I went to bed happier than I had ever been in a long time. I was looking forward to our excursion and dinner with Sarah. The next morning, I woke up to a heavy knocking on my room door. I had booked a 2-room suite for the kids and me. The kids were still asleep in one of the bedrooms. As I hurriedly pulled on my pants and shirt, stumbling, I walked to the door and opened it. In the doorway stood a solid, middle-aged elderly man with a newspaper under his arm. "Sorry for the intrusion, Mr. Adams," the man apologized. "My name is James Batterman, and I am the manager of this hotel. I sincerely apologize for disturbing your sleep, but I urgently need to speak with you." Still half asleep, I gestured for the man to come in. Behind him, a waiter wheeled in a cart with juice, tea, coffee, and set dishes. Mr. Batterman told the waiter to bring the cart in and set everything on a table in the corner. As soon as everything was ready, the waiter left. Mr. Batterman immediately poured me a cup of coffee, which I gratefully accepted. "I think you should sit down, Mr. Adams. There's some news I'm pretty sure you're completely unaware of," Mr. Batterman said. As soon as I sat down, Mr. Batterman spread a newspaper in front of me. The headline read, "The Mystery of Prince Peter's Child Abduction Solved." Under the headline, but still above the fold, was a color photo of me. I quickly flipped through the article and groaned. My thoughts were scattered in different directions, but first and foremost, I was thinking about protecting my children. When I reached the end of the article and realized that I had been completely exposed, I looked up at Mr. Batterman. "How bad is it?" I asked. "Right now, hundreds of people and dozens of media members are crowding outside the hotel, hoping to see you. Apparently, word has leaked out that you are in London and staying here. The TV stations have been talking about you all morning. I expect the crowd outside the hotel to grow. I've already asked the police for crowd control. Simply put, Mr. Adams, you've become a media sensation. All of Britain wants to know everything about you," Mr. Batterman explained. My mind was a complete mess, and I still didn't know what to do. But then I suddenly felt like I knew why Mr. Batterman had visited me. "I suppose you want us to be stationed elsewhere?" I asked. "Oh, good heavens no," Mr. Batterman said with a look of horror. "I've only come to let you know what's happening and to assure you that we will do everything within our power to protect your privacy." Only when Mr. Batterman said privacy did he pronounce it like privacy. "What do you suggest I do?" I still didn't know what to make of this mess and was more than terrified of it all. And that was only my first encounter with the unfolding madness. It only got worse as time went on. "I would personally suggest that you and your family stay at the hotel, at least for tonight," Mr. Batterman suggested. "Hopefully, things will quiet down, and people will eventually lose interest. I'll contact my office and see what they have to offer. The only problem with your plan is that we are scheduled to have dinner with a friend at Pella's restaurant," I pointed out. Mr. Batterman thought for a moment and then offered a solution. "May I suggest you invite a guest here and have dinner at the Grove downstairs? It's a 4-star restaurant with 46 seats, so it will be quiet and private." I told Mr. Batterman that his offer was excellent and that I would cancel my order at Pottle and make a new one at Grove. "Please let me take care of that for you," he offered, and I agreed. I was still in shock at what was happening. Besides, I hadn't even seen what was going on outside yet. "Mr. Batterman, can I ask you a question?" I hoped he could help me make sense of it all. "I'll answer anything I can," he replied. "Why is this so important now?" I asked. The kidnapping happened over 6 years ago. Maybe the police fudged the details a little, but what does it matter? The prince was rescued and he's safe and sound. Mr. Batterman studied me for a while, then smiled good-naturedly. "Mr. Adams, you're American, so our royal family is more of a gimmick to your people. But to those who are truly British, the monarchy is the foundation of our country. The whole country was stunned when it became known that the Crown Prince had been kidnapped. The whole of Great Britain was plunged into fear and grief. When he was rescued, however, the nation rejoiced as one. If you remember, the news of his safe return sparked 3 days of celebrations. And now you learn that you, sir, saved the prince, and that you sought no recognition for your actions. You have struck a chord and evoked the gratitude of this nation. All I can say is that every member of my staff considers it an honor to serve you in any way we can. Also, I want you to know that you will not be charged for anything during your stay at the Langham Hotel. No, I can't agree with that, Mr. Batterman, I protested immediately. Our being here is already causing you and your staff a lot of inconvenience. Mr. Batterman held up his hands. If it will appease your sense of justice, I spoke to the head office this morning, and they're thrilled with the free publicity. Already bookings are up over 18%. When Mr. Batterman left, Grant and Louise came out of their bedroom. The breakfast that Mr. Batterman left behind included bacon, eggs, bagels, and Danish. There was also oatmeal. I made plates for both of them and sat them down in front of the TV. I ordered the movie Toy Story for them. It was their favorite movie. Then it was time to make some phone calls. The first thing I did was call a family meeting. I woke up both grandparents and asked them to come to my room as soon as possible. After that, I called Sarah to tell her about the change of plans. When I called her, she picked up on the first ring. Michael, I can hardly believe what I'm seeing on TV. Is any or all of it true? Unfortunately, all of that is true, I confirmed. I'm sorry I wasn't honest with you, but the truth is I wanted to put it all behind me. Is that why you canceled our dinner date? Sarah said in a voice that sounded both questioning and affirming. Yes, I'm sorry I deceived you, I apologized. But the British government agreed with me that it would be best if I left the country quickly and quietly. Is what they say about your injuries true? They say you almost died. Aren't they exaggerating? No exaggeration, it's all true. But that's okay. I wanted to divert from the subject of myself to the subject of dinner that night. Michael, this is a big deal, Sarah protested, and I thought she was angry with me, but she wasn't. I mean, you had to go through this whole ordeal alone and then come home and see your wife get killed. At that point, she started crying. Please, Sarah, don't cry. There's nothing wrong with me. I just called to see if you'd mind if we ate at the hotel tonight. All things considered, I understand if you don't want to come. I mean, the media is making things completely crazy around here. I'll definitely be there tonight, Sarah stated immediately. There's no way I'm letting you cancel another dinner because of me. I'll see you at 6. When my grandparents arrived, I just laid out the newspapers. Then I took them to my room and turned on the TV. The wall-to-wall news was talking about me. I was beyond excited as I looked out the window onto the street in front of the hotel. I saw hundreds of people. The police had set up barricades, moved people across the street, and kept them from moving. The whole scene was surreal. When my mom read this story, she suddenly cried. This day was getting worse and worse. What's wrong, Mom? I asked anxiously. You almost died, but you never told us about it, she sobbed. I'm sorry, but I thought it was best to keep it all a secret in case terrorists were behind the kidnapping. I didn't want them to come after anyone else in my family. And when it turned out they weren't terrorists, I didn't see the need to revisit the past. I'm not sure if my mom liked my explanation, but she accepted it. We met in my hotel room before going downstairs for dinner. Sarah looked amazing, and my parents were very curious about her. She charmed them easily, and soon they were laughing at her stories about how she was the assistant principal. The dinner started very awkwardly. The whole restaurant stood up and applauded when we entered, then people started coming up to our table to introduce themselves and thank me. I just smiled and introduced them to my family and Sarah as people continued to approach our table. Grant finally turned to me and asked, "Dad, are you famous?" "I guess so," I replied, "but I don't want to be." It was at dinner that Sarah gave me the first good news of the day. After explaining who I was, the school board had approved a 2-week paid vacation for her. Sarah would now be able to come with us and be our tour guide. The only question now was whether we would be able to make the trip. In the middle of dinner, Mr. Batterman approached our table. "I'm very sorry to interrupt you, but may I speak to you, Mr. Adams?" I apologized and followed the hotel manager to a quiet spot by the door to the kitchen. There, he looked around to make sure no one was within earshot. "Mr. Adams, I've contacted our head office," he began, "and I was afraid we were about to be asked to leave. They have a pretty good suggestion. They think you could lower the media frenzy if you held an impromptu press conference tomorrow. We could hold it in our ballroom, of course. The decision is yours alone." I ran that sentence through my head a few times and I liked it. I think it's a great idea. What do I need to do to make it happen? Mr. Batterman smiled and shook his head. "Absolutely nothing. We'll work it out. I suggest 10 o'clock tomorrow morning. You will need to report in whatever clothes you are wearing. You should prepare a short statement, and then we'll give the press 30 minutes for questions." My parents and in-laws were very impressed when I told them about the press conference. My kids didn't care because they were waiting for their cake and ice cream. The next day, I confess I was scared to death. I'd never done anything even remotely similar, plus I've never been a fan of public speaking. At 9:55, Mr. Batterman ushered me into the main ballroom. I was stunned by the transformation. American flags and British Union Jacks covered the back wall. Red, white, and blue garlands were hung throughout the room. The hotel orchestra was positioned to the right of the podium, with American and British flags crossed in front of them. As we walked to the podium, I noticed that hundreds of people were gathered in the auditorium, with TV cameras set up all around the back. My legs felt like jelly as I walked down the center aisle. Suddenly, people started to rise and clap when I reached the entrance. The sound was deafening. My family followed me, and they were pointed to seats near the entrance. My children's eyes widened, and they looked around the hall in utter amazement. My mother and mother-in-law had tears running down their cheeks. When they were finally seated, my children were bouncing in their chairs, asking their grandparents one question after another. As we climbed onto the hastily constructed platform, the band began to play the Star-Spangled Banner, followed immediately by God Save the King. Mr. Batterman then stepped to the microphone and thanked everyone for coming. He gave a brief introduction. I had written a short speech, but I immediately put it aside. I decided that I would just brush it off and let everyone know that I was grateful and humbled by the outpouring, but felt very unworthy of it all. Then the questions began. They wanted to know everything that had happened. One of the first questions was how I knew where the prince was in order to save him. I admitted that I only found out about him being a prince later at the hospital. I then explained that I was hopelessly lost and was hoping some kind person would point me in the right direction. This elicited laughter from the stern journalists. They were especially interested in the details of the firefight. I talked a little about it, but spent most of the time thanking the SAS who had actually saved us. As I pointed out, if they hadn't arrived, I would be dead, and probably the prince too. After Mr. Batterman thanked everyone for coming, the reporters were still shouting out questions as I left. I did my best to answer the ones I heard. Thankfully, I quickly left the ballroom and went back to my room. My kids were all around me, talking about all the people who came to see me. The grandparents were over the moon with excitement. Of course, when I planned this trip, none of us expected anything like this. A few minutes later, there was a knock on the door. When I opened it, Sarah was standing there, smiling at me. I hugged her and thanked her for coming. She laughed and said, as they say in America, wild horses couldn't keep me away. "Michael, you were marvelous." I was sitting in one of the back rows, and I've never heard the press so enthusiastic about anyone. Usually, they're pretty cranky and looking for the next scandal, but they love the way you try to put the blame on everyone else. They especially liked it when you talked about your deep respect and admiration for the prince and how courageous he was. As I said, you were brilliant. The next day, we were all invited to Buckingham Palace, even Sarah, which really surprised me. It was during this visit that I learned something very unique about Sarah. First of all, she was a close friend of the Queen. They went to school together. The second thing I learned was that her real name was Lady Sarah Smi. Her father was a duke. I blacked out when Sarah started explaining her family history. It was too complicated. Finally, the next day, we went on a field trip. The government provided a car with 2 security agents to ensure our safety. Security was not offered, it was required so we could go on the tour. It seemed to me that the whole thing was a waste of those security guards' time, but Sarah was happy to be guarded, so I didn't make a fuss. Our first stop was in Manchester. I have always been a huge soccer fan. I even played on my high school team and an intramural team in college. Manchester United has always been my favorite professional team. I was hoping we would get to see the field before we toured the city. The Manchester club did a much better job. When they found out I wanted to take a look at the field, they organized a small reception at the stadium. There, they took me out onto the pitch with my family and Sarah. I even got to meet a few of the players. I was stunned at how nice everyone was to us. Our next stop was Liverpool, and thankfully, it was a quiet visit since our schedule was not publicized, and the royal family had asked the press to respect our privacy. We fitted in and had a wonderful time. From Liverpool, we headed north, stopping wherever Sarah thought we might like. Probably because she was a teacher, Sarah had a wealth of information. It was much more fun to have someone who understood the history and significance of each place we stopped. We arrived in Glasgow and then Edinburgh, which we decided to make our base. From there, we could make day trips anywhere we wanted to go. Once again, we were free to move around. The initial excitement subsided, and I became yesterday's news. I was very happy about it. There is no way in the world I can understand why anyone would volunteer to become a celebrity. During this tour, I discovered that Sarah is not only a wonderful guide, but I was absolutely enamored with her. My parents and even my parents-in-law quickly fell in love with Sarah, and the kids were crazy about her. We started out as casual acquaintances, and now we've become close friends. And one evening, as Sarah and I were taking a walk, I discovered that my feelings for her were much deeper than that. We stopped to look at Edinburgh Castle, and then, on impulse, I leaned over and kissed Sarah gently on the lips. She looked at me in surprise, then wrapped her arms around me and kissed me passionately. We went back to her room, but I didn't know what to do next. Fortunately, Sarah had some ideas of her own. She quickly started undressing me, and I, getting the hint, started undressing her. Naked, we both slid into her bed. As we lay there looking at each other, she said, "Please don't hurt me. I'll be very gentle." I assured her, "No, that's not what I meant." She said with fear in her eyes, "I know you like me, Michael, but I'm desperately in love with you. I'll still sleep with you, but if it's not serious, please tell me. I'll be hurt, but I'll break if you lead me on." "Sarah, when Carrie died, I thought I could never love another woman," I said softly. "You showed me that I was wrong. I can't promise a happy ending, but I love you, and I feel so comfortable and at peace when you're around." That was all Sarah wanted to hear. After that, she turned into a wild woman. She couldn't seem to get enough of me. At first, our lovemaking was wild passion, but then it became slow and gentle. At 2 a.m, I slipped out of bed and went back to my room. I didn't want my grandparents to know what Sarah and I had been doing. I was fooling myself, however, because the next day at breakfast, they were full of smiles and words for both Sarah and me. All too soon, the tour was over, and we were back in London. I had arranged for my mom to watch the 2 kids, and Sarah and I had a chance to spend our last night together. The day we left was filled with hugs, kisses, and tears. I think Sarah was afraid that when I got home, I would forget about her. That didn't happen. In the months that followed, I talked to her every day and sometimes several times a day. The children loved it when Sarah called because she always had some funny and fantastic story to tell them. Finally, I couldn't stand it any longer, flew to London, and asked Sarah to be my wife. She, of course, said yes. We then went to talk to her father, who I found out was the Duke of Stirling. Sarah's mother had died a few years before. The Duke of Stirling, or Percy as he asked his friends and family to call him, lived on the family estate. The house was huge, and the grounds were substantial. Sarah explained that farming the estate covered most of the expenses, but not all, so the Duke opened the family home for tours. The money from these excursions covered the difference, and the Duke had more than enough to live on. "So, you wish to marry my little Sarah?" the Duke asked with a smile. "Yes, sir, very much so," I replied. "Do you know that her brother Edward will inherit the title and estates?" he asked, as if that could have bothered me. "Not only that, but her title will die with her. It cannot be passed on to any of her children, sir." "Let me assure you that I don't care at all if Sarah has a title or not," I replied with a smile. "I love her, and I want to make her happy. I know she will be very happy if you give us your blessing. However, with your blessing or not, I intend to marry Sarah if she agrees to marry me." The Duke grinned. "That is a beautiful answer. I give my blessing with all my love." The wedding was modest, but it was still bigger than I would have liked. About 100 people were present, including the king and queen. Peter was also there with a beautiful girl. He was already a teenager, and he was soon to marry and produce an heir. My father was best man, and both my children were in the wedding party. Sarah and I spent our honeymoon in Bermuda and then flew back to the UK. We decided that we would live in England during the school year and America during the summer vacation. Grant and Louise were enrolled at Ludgrove. From what I understand, this was a school that many royal families sent their children to. Sarah also adopted Grant and Louise when we lived in the UK. Okay, the Queen asked Sarah and me to do some royal duties from time to time. These included visiting sick people in hospitals, visiting different schools, or opening new factories. Each time we performed these duties, Sarah and I were warmly welcomed, admittedly. I didn't have much faith in it at first, but Sarah always made sure that the outings were fun for me. Every time, she rewarded me for it in the bedroom, wherever we were, whether in the United Kingdom or the United States. Peter keeps in touch with us. When he made an official trip to the United States, he wanted to stay with us, but his guards refused to consider this option for security reasons. Peter has grown from a frightened boy to a very confident, dynamic, and charismatic young man. I could not be prouder of him if he were my own son. 2 years after the wedding, Sarah gave birth to a baby boy. She insisted on naming him Michael Jr. A year later. We had a baby girl, and we named her Charlotte. 18 months after that, another boy came along. We named him Thomas in honor of my father. After all the pain and horror, my new life was so different but so loving. I felt truly blessed. Our 5th wedding anniversary is approaching, and we decided to celebrate with dinner and a show. I bought Sarah a gold necklace with 3 gold heart-shaped charms, with the names and birth dates of each of our children written on the front. I hope she likes it. Sarah, I'm trying to finish Michael's journal for him. The night of our 5th anniversary, we went out to dinner, and there Michael gave me a gold necklace that I now wear every day. I was so happy and overwhelmed with love for my husband. I wasn't thinking about the play we were going to see. I was only thinking about what we were going to do afterward. As we were leaving the restaurant, I heard someone yelling at me. When I looked back, I saw my ex-husband, who was drunk and holding a gun. He was yelling, "If I can't have you, no one can." The moment he fired, Michael pushed me away. So instead of the bullet hitting me, it hit Michael in the middle of his chest. All I remember after that was screaming for someone to help us. Michael was in the hospital for 3 days, and I was by his side the whole time. On the evening of the 3rd day, when he opened his eyes, I was so happy to have Michael back with me. But he had just gathered his last reserves to tell me one last time that he loved me. Shortly after that, he died. It's been 2 months since I last wrote in Michael's journal. I thought I could do it, but I didn't have the energy. Then, I'm afraid I have to type his diary because my tears smeared the ink and crinkled most of the pages. I'm still struggling with the loss of Michael. Our children are suffering too, and I have to be strong for them. My ex-husband was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. The news of Michael's death hit the people of the UK and the US very hard. Flags were lowered to half-staff. Since Michael was a veteran, he was buried with full military honors in his hometown. Much to my surprise, the King and Queen attended the funeral. Peter was there too. He tried his best to be brave, but broke down when the coffin was lowered into the ground. In a rare display of emotion for the royal family, the Queen hugged her son as he cried. Now I have to pick up the pieces of my life. It's very hard, but Michael had left me one gift that I hoped would help me get through it. That night at dinner, I told my husband that I was pregnant again. I had a baby girl, and I named her Mary after my mother. She has Michael's eyes and his smile. I have to stop because it's time to feed Mary. All I can do now is try my best for my children, especially because I know that's what Michael wants me to do. Lord, give me strength. I still love and miss him very much. Greetings. If you found these contents valuable, please consider sharing them with your friends and family. Additionally, if you've enjoyed this video, a simple click on the like button would greatly support our podcast in reaching a wider audience, as YouTube's algorithm favors such engagement. Subscribing to the channel for notifications whenever new content is uploaded is also highly encouraged. Thank you sincerely for your support, and may you have a wonderful day.